paper, codes, and Churchill's directive. On the night of November 6, 1941, a converted Handley Page Halifax bomber droned low over the flat expanse of occupied Holland. Inside the fuselage, two men sat in near-total darkness, their parachute harnesses pulled tight against their chests, their breath visible in the freezing air at altitude. One of them was Hubertus Lauders, a bespectacled 26-year-old who had been working on a rubber plantation in Singapore when the war began. The other was Thais Taconis, trained for sabotage. Neither man carried a weapon of any real consequence. They had no explosives strapped to their bodies, no heavy equipment, no radio apparatus beyond a compact suitcase-sized transmitter that would be buried upon landing and retrieved only when needed. What they carried, above all else, was paper. Folded into the linings of their clothing and memorized in fragments were cipher keys, coded frequencies, transmission schedules, and the names and addresses of contacts on the ground. It was the architecture of an invisible network, a web of signals meant to connect a fledgling Dutch resistance to the beating heart of British intelligence in London. In the calculus of secret warfare, paper was the most essential cargo an agent could carry. It was also, as events would prove, the most dangerous. Within months, every scrap of what these two men brought into the Netherlands would be in German hands, and in German hands that paper would become something its creators never imagined. A weapon so effective it would dismantle an entire Allied intelligence operation from the inside, claim the lives of dozens of agents, and cripple the Dutch resistance for the remainder of the war. The organization that sent Lauders and Taconis into the darkness that night was the Special Operations Executive, known by its initials as SOE. It had been created on July 22, 1940, at the direction of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who gave it a mandate that was romantic in its ambition and brutal in its implications: to set Europe ablaze. SOE was not a conventional military body. It existed to wage irregular warfare, sabotage, subversion, the arming and organizing of resistance movements in countries crushed beneath Nazi occupation. Its agents were trained in demolition, silent killing, radio communications, and the art of assuming false identities. They were recruited from across the British Empire and the governments in exile that had gathered in London, and they were dropped behind enemy lines, with the understanding that capture almost certainly meant death. SOE operated in France, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, Czechoslovakia, and a dozen other theaters of shadow war. But few of its sections faced a more unforgiving operational environment than Section N, the branch responsible for the Netherlands. Holland was, in almost every conceivable way, hostile terrain for covert operations. The country was small, densely populated, and topographically flat. There were no mountain ranges to shelter guerrilla fighters, no deep forests in which to hide arms caches or establish safe zones. The coastline was low and exposed, its beaches patrolled and mined by German garrison forces who understood the vulnerability of a nation bordered by the North Sea. Inland, the landscape offered little cover: open polders, neat agricultural fields, and canal networks that made movement predictable and observable. Unlike France, which shared a long border with neutral Spain and Switzerland, the Netherlands had no neighboring unoccupied country through which agents could be inserted overland. Every SOE operative sent into Holland had to arrive by air, either by parachute from a bomber flying at low altitude, or by Westland Lysander, a small aircraft capable of landing and taking off from short, improvised strips in open fields. Both methods required ground-level coordination with local contacts, precise timing, and an extraordinary degree of trust in people the agents had often never met. In a country as flat and surveilled as the Netherlands, a single error in any part of that chain could be fatal. Section N was aware of these challenges, at least in theory. In practice, it was chronically understaffed, institutionally unstable, and operationally immature. It cycled through 4 section chiefs over the course of the war: R.V. Laming, Charles Blizzard, Seymour Bingham, and R.I. Dobson, none of whom managed to impose lasting coherence on its operations. M.R.D. Foote, The official historian of SOE would later describe Section N as not always noted for efficiency. A judgment that amounted to a diplomatic indictment. The section struggled to recruit Dutch agents, struggled to train them adequately, and struggled to provide them with the basic operational tools they needed. Convincing forged documents, appropriate clothing, reliable contacts on the ground. Agents in training complained about these deficiencies. Their complaints were met not with reform but with confinement. The disaffected trainees were locked away and released only after the Dutch government in exile intervened and the men signed agreements to remain silent. On the other side of the North Sea in the occupied Netherlands, the men who would turn SOE's weaknesses into a catastrophe were already in place. Major Hermann Giskes of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, headed counterintelligence operations in Holland. Giskes was 46 years old, a veteran of the First World War who had spent much of the interwar period running his family's tobacco business before returning to intelligence work. He was not a fanatic. He was methodical, skeptical, and possessed of a dry operational patience that made him ideally suited to the slow, meticulous work of counterespionage. Alongside him worked Major Joseph Schreider of the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence arm of the SS. Together, they controlled a surveillance apparatus that monitored radio transmissions, tracked suspicious movements, and cultivated informants within the Dutch population. They knew the terrain they were defending, not just its geography, but its social rhythms, its vulnerabilities, the patterns of daily life that made a stranger conspicuous and a hidden transmitter detectable. By the time Lauders and Taconis floated down through the cold November air near Omen in Overijssel province, the ground beneath them was already watched. The paper they carried, those cipher keys, those frequencies, those carefully memorized names, was meant to be the lifeline that kept them connected to London and kept the Dutch resistance alive. It was meant to keep them safe. It would do the opposite. The arrest that London refused to see. The first months passed with fragile normalcy. Lauders set up his transmitter in safe houses across the Hague, moving periodically to avoid the German direction-finding teams that swept the city's airwaves with methodical regularity. He transmitted on schedule, encoded his messages with the cipher he had been trained to use, and included the 2 security checks that every SOE agent was required to embed in every signal. Deliberate errors, prearranged between the agent and London, whose presence confirmed that the sender was the legitimate operator and was acting of his own free will. The absence of those checks was supposed to trigger an immediate alarm. It meant the agent had been captured, compromised, or was transmitting under coercion. This was the system's most fundamental safeguard. It was the one thing that could not be faked, because only the agent and his handlers in London knew the specific form the checks would take. Lauders used them faithfully. He had no reason to believe they would ever be ignored. On March 6, 1942, that faith was put to its first and only test. German counterintelligence had been tracking Lauders's signal. Direction-finding teams had narrowed the transmission source to the Fahrenheit strat in The Hague, to the home of a family sympathetic to the resistance. When the Abwehr's men arrived, Lauders was at his set, mid-transmission. He was arrested on the spot. 3 days later, Thijs Taconis was captured as well. In the span of a single week, SOE's only 2 active agents in the Netherlands were in German custody. The fledgling network that London had spent months building, the contacts, the supply lines, the coded frequencies, was now entirely exposed. What followed was not a violent interrogation. Hermann Giskes understood that a broken agent was less useful than a cooperative one. He presented Lauders with a proposition that was clinical in its simplicity. Continue transmitting to London as though nothing had happened, and your life will be spared. The messages would be drafted by the Abwehr. Lauders would encode and transmit them in his own hand, using his own Morse fist, the distinctive rhythm and cadence of his keystrokes that London's receiving operators would recognize as authentic. Giskes asked Lauders directly about his security checks. It was the critical question, and Lauders knew it. He lied, providing Giskes with a plausible but false version of the checks. Then he agreed to transmit, fully confident that London would detect the absence of his genuine security signals and treat every subsequent message as compromised. The system had been designed precisely for this moment. Lauders believed in it. London received the first messages from the captured Lauders within days. They arrived at SOE's Signals Directorate and were decoded. The internal handling notes flagged exactly what Lauders had intended them to flag. The notation was blunt and unambiguous. Bluff check omitted, true check omitted. Both security checks, the one an agent could surrender under torture, and the deeper one he was expected to protect at all costs, were missing. In any functioning intelligence system, this notation would have triggered an immediate reassessment of the agent's status, a suspension of communications, and a full review of every piece of information the channel had produced. SOE's Dutch section did none of these things. The warnings were noted and then dismissed. The messages were accepted as genuine. The reasons for this catastrophic failure were not mysterious. They were institutional. By March 1942, Section N had only 3 active agents in the entire Netherlands. It had struggled for over a year to recruit suitable operatives, to train them and to get them into the country. The section was under pressure from SOE leadership, from the Dutch government in exile, and from the broader bureaucratic competition with MI6 to demonstrate that it was producing results. Acknowledging that its agents had been compromised would mean admitting that its entire Dutch program was a failure. It would mean starting over with nothing. The incentive to believe that the missing security checks were the result of atmospheric interference, operator error, or simple carelessness was overwhelming. And so belief won out over evidence. Denial became not a lapse, but a policy, a quiet, self-reinforcing decision, never formally made and never formally questioned, to accept the signals at face value and move forward. Lauders, still alive and still transmitting under German supervision, understood almost immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. London was responding to his messages as though they were genuine. Requests were being fulfilled. Operational details were being shared. No one had raised an alarm. He began to improvise, where his standard sign-off was supposed to read QRU, a common radio abbreviation meaning, I have nothing further. He substituted the letters CAU. When protocol called for QSY to indicate a frequency change, he sent GHT instead. Read together across successive transmissions. The fragments spelled a single word. Caught. He went further, attempting to weave the phrase worked by Jerry since March 6 into the random padding characters that bookended his encoded messages. But the Abwehr, perhaps sensing the risk of such embedded warnings, imposed a rule forbidding him from using vowels in his padding. Lauders adapted, tried again, found new ways to signal his distress. None of it was noticed. Not the altered sign-offs, not the embedded letters, not the missing security checks that had been flagged from the very first compromised transmission. London was not listening, not because the signals were unclear, but because the institution receiving them had already decided what it wanted to hear. For Giskes, the implications were vast and immediate. He had not merely captured a single radio operator, he had gained control of a live communications channel to the heart of British clandestine operations in Holland. Every request he transmitted through Lauders, for additional agents, for supply drops, for weapons for money, London would fulfill because London believed the channel was secure. The Abwehr Major recognized that the opportunity before him was no longer tactical. It was strategic. He could use this single compromised link to draw the entire SOE apparatus in the Netherlands into his hands, agent by agent, drop by drop, until there was nothing left to draw. The England game, the machinery of deception began to run with industrial precision in the spring of 1942. Through Lauders, and subsequently through other captured radio operators whose sets and ciphers fell intact into German hands, Giskes and Schreider fed a steady stream of fabricated intelligence back to London. Mock resistance groups were invented. Sabotage successes were reported in detail, operations that had never taken place against targets that were never touched. The fictional landscape of a thriving Dutch underground took shape in the filing cabinets of Baker Street, and SOE's Dutch section accepted it as real. More than that, they responded to it. When the fictitious resistance groups requested agents to lead them, London began preparing operatives for insertion. When the fabricated networks asked for weapons and explosives to carry out the next phase of operations, SOE arranged supply drops. The requests flowed east across the North Sea in encrypted Morse. The responses flowed back as flesh and steel, falling by parachute into the flat Dutch night. The flights departed from RAF Tempsford, a secret airfield in Bedfordshire that served as the primary staging base for SOE's air operations. Converted Handley Page Halifax bombers carried agents and supply containers over the Channel and across the occupied Low Countries at low altitude, navigating by moonlight and dead reckoning to reach prearranged drop zones in the Dutch countryside. Westland Lysander aircraft, small and maneuverable enough to land in a farmer's field and take off again within minutes, were used for the most sensitive insertions. On the ground, reception committees were supposed to be waiting, small teams of resistance fighters who would guide the arriving agents to safe houses and collect the supply canisters before dawn. In every case, the reception committees were German. Abwehr and SD operatives, sometimes accompanied by Dutch police collaborators, stood in the darkness with the correct signal lights and the correct recognition codes, all of which had been extracted from previously captured agents or transmitted to London by Giskes' own hand. The arriving agents stepped out of the night sky and into captivity. Some were seized within seconds of touching the ground. Others were allowed a few moments of apparent normalcy, a handshake, a cigarette, a whispered exchange of pleasantries, before arms closed around them from behind and the handcuffs appeared. By the end of 1942, 25 SOE agents had been dropped into the Netherlands. Every single one had been arrested on arrival or within hours of landing. Not one had made contact with a genuine resistance group. Not one had transmitted a single free message back to London. The scale of the operation was remarkable, not just for its efficiency, but for its psychological architecture. Giskes had refined an interrogation methodology that exploited the very trust SOE's agents placed in their own organization. When a new prisoner was brought before German intelligence officers, the first thing they were told, calmly, almost sympathetically, was that they had been betrayed. Someone in London, the interrogators explained, was working for the Germans. That was why every agent had been captured. That was why the reception committees had been waiting. The prisoners had not been defeated by German skill. They had been sold out by British treachery. It was a lie, but it was a lie that fit the evidence available to a captured agent far more neatly than the truth. Something had obviously gone catastrophically wrong. The agents knew they had followed their orders precisely, used the correct codes, arrived at the correct coordinates. The only explanation that made sense, from inside a German cell, was that the information had been compromised at the source. The psychological impact was devastating. Most agents, confronted with this narrative, cooperated within days. Not because they were cowards, and not always because they were tortured, but because the belief that their own organization had abandoned them severed the one bond that might have sustained resistance: loyalty to London. Even those who held back critical information still provided fragments: the name of an instructor, the layout of a training facility, the color of wallpaper in a particular room. These details were catalogued and fed to subsequent prisoners, reinforcing the illusion that the Germans had a source inside SOE who was providing everything. Each new arrival cracked a little faster than the last. The Gestapo, eager to claim credit for the operation and to edge out the Abwehr in the ongoing rivalry between German intelligence agencies, gave the enterprise its enduring name, Das Englandspiel, the England game. The material cost mounted alongside the human one. Over the course of the operation, SOE delivered approximately 355,500 Dutch guilders into German hands. a sum equivalent to roughly 130,000 American dollars at wartime exchange rates. Weapons caches intended for resistance fighters were collected by German soldiers at the drop zones. New types of communications equipment, including prototype radio sets, were studied by Abwehr technicians. Perhaps most damagingly, the coded messages flowing between London and the fictitious Dutch networks contained the names and addresses of suggested contacts, real Dutch citizens whom Soe believed could be trusted to support the resistance. These names were passed directly to the German security services. Arrests followed. Men and women who had never held a weapon, who had never sent or received a coded message, who in many cases did not even know that their names had been transmitted across the North Sea, were pulled from their homes and interrogated. The operation was no longer just catching spies. It was dismantling the Dutch resistance's infrastructure at the root, destroying potential networks before they could form, and it was doing so with information that London itself had supplied. Amid this deepening catastrophe, one person inside SOE had begun to sense that something was profoundly wrong. His name was Leo Marx. He was 22 years old, the son of a London bookseller, and he worked as a cryptographer in SOE's Signals Directorate on Baker Street. His job was to improve the security of the codes used by agents in the field and to ensure that the signals flowing back to London were authentic. He was young, abrasive, and relentlessly analytical. And as the winter of 1942 turned toward spring, he found himself staring at the Dutch message traffic with a growing unease he could not yet fully articulate. A feeling that the numbers did not add up, that the patterns were wrong, that something in the clean, orderly flow of transmissions from Holland was too smooth, too precise, too perfect to be real. The messages that were too perfect. The insight arrived not as a thunderclap, but as an accumulation of small, nagging irregularities that refused to resolve themselves into anything innocent. Leo Marx spent his days surrounded by the raw material of secret warfare, stacks of decoded messages from SOE agents operating across occupied Europe, each one representing a life at risk and a connection maintained under extraordinary pressure. The messages from France were riddled with encoding errors. The messages from Norway contained garbled passages that had to be laboriously reconstructed by Marx and his team before they yielded coherent text. The messages from Poland, from Yugoslavia, from Czechoslovakia, all bore the unmistakable fingerprints of men and women working in fear, encoding under stress, transmitting from improvised positions with portable equipment while German direction-finding trucks circled their neighborhoods. These imperfections were not flaws in the system. They were proof that the system was working. An agent crouched in an attic, listening for footsteps on the stairs while encoding a message by candlelight, was going to make mistakes. That was expected. That was human. That was real. The Dutch messages were none of these things. They arrived clean. Every cipher group was correctly formed. Every letter was in its proper place. There were no transposition errors, no garbled passages, no requests for London to repeat a transmission because of interference or encoding failure. In the entire body of signals traffic flowing from Holland, Marx could not find a single instance of the kind of routine error that every other section's agents produced regularly. It was as though the Dutch operatives were encoding in conditions of perfect calm, with perfect equipment, under no pressure whatsoever. Marx turned the anomaly over in his mind, approaching it from every angle he could think of. Perhaps the Dutch agents were simply better trained. Perhaps they had access to superior radio sets. Perhaps the atmospheric conditions over the Netherlands were unusually favorable for clear transmission. He eliminated each possibility in turn. The Dutch agents had come through the same training pipeline as everyone else, in some cases a pipeline whose deficiencies they had actively complained about. Their equipment was standard issue, and atmospheric conditions did not explain why their encoded text was immaculate, because encoding happened before transmission. The errors Marx was looking for occurred in the cipher work itself, on paper before the operator ever touched the Morse key. There was only one explanation that fit the evidence. The messages were not being encoded by SOE agents in the field. They were being encoded by professional cryptographers working in comfort, without stress, without fear, and almost certainly without any connection to the Allied cause. The Dutch network was in German hands. Marx did not arrive at this conclusion casually. He tested it. He discovered that alone among SOE's agents worldwide, the Dutch operatives never asked London to retransmit a message due to interference. Every other section's agents routinely made such requests. It was one of the unavoidable frustrations of clandestine radio communication conducted at range with low-power equipment. The Dutch never did. Marx also noted that when he sent a deliberately garbled test message to one of the Dutch agents, a message so corrupted that no field operative working with standard SOE cipher methods could reasonably decode it, the agent responded correctly. A German cryptographer with access to the full apparatus of signals intelligence could decode such a message. A frightened young Dutchman working in an attic with a one-time pad could not. The evidence was converging on a single terrible conclusion, and Marx knew it. He reported his findings to his superiors. He laid out the pattern: the absent errors, the absent retransmission requests, the decoded test message, the missing security checks that had been flagged and ignored since the very first compromised signal from Lauders. He wrote a formal report in January 1943 and submitted it to SOE's leadership, stating his belief that all or nearly all of the Dutch agents were operating under German control. The response he received was not an investigation. It was a directive to remain silent. Marx was told that his suspicions were to be shared with no one, not the Dutch section, not MI6, not the Dutch government in exile. The reasons were never stated explicitly, but they did not need to be. SOE existed in a state of perpetual institutional warfare with MI6, which had regarded the younger organization as a reckless interloper since its creation in 1940. MI6 argued that SOE's sabotage operations provoked German crackdowns that endangered MI6's own carefully cultivated intelligence networks. If the Dutch disaster became known, if it could be demonstrated that SOE had fed dozens of agents, hundreds of thousands of guilders, and tons of weapons directly into the hands of German counterintelligence, the political consequences would be existential. SOE might not survive the scandal. Departments might be dissolved. Careers would end. And so the institution chose silence. Marx was silenced, and the machine continued to run. In February and March of 1943, 11 more agents were sent to the Netherlands. They parachuted from Halifax bombers into the flat Dutch countryside and were arrested on landing. Every one of them. The total number of captured operatives now exceeded 35, and the flow of weapons, money, and intelligence into German hands had not slowed. But even as SOE's leadership refused to act, another institution, one with no stake in the Dutch section's reputation and no interest in interdepartmental politics, was reaching its own conclusions. The Royal Air Force, which supplied the planes and pilots for SOE's air operations, had noticed a disturbing pattern in the Dutch missions. Flights into the Netherlands arrived at their drop zones without incident. The landing areas were always perfectly prepared. Signal lights in position, ground markers clearly visible. No interference from German defenses. The approaches were, in the words of one RAF assessment, too bloody perfect, but the return flights were a different matter entirely. On the way back to England, the aircraft were intercepted and attacked with a consistency that went far beyond the normal hazards of flying over occupied territory. In less than a year, 12 RAF aircraft had been shot down during return flights from Dutch SOE missions, a loss rate that was staggering by any operational standard. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to read it. The Germans knew exactly when the planes were coming and exactly when they were leaving. They let them arrive because the cargo was valuable. They attacked them on the return because the planes were expendable. In May 1943, the RAF informed SOE that it would no longer provide aircraft for operations over the Netherlands. The decision was driven by the practical calculus of aircrew losses, not by intelligence analysis. But it accomplished what SOE's own signals directorate, what Leo Marx's reports, what Lauers's missing security checks, and what the flawless message traffic had all failed to accomplish. It stopped the flow of agents into the trap, not because anyone in authority had finally acknowledged the truth, but because the pilots who flew the missions were dying at a rate that could no longer be sustained. The escape from Haren. In the Dutch town of Haren, in a converted Catholic seminary that had been requisitioned as a holding facility for captured intelligence operatives, the men who had fallen into the England spiel waited in a silence that grew heavier with each passing month. The building retained the institutional calm of its original purpose: long corridors, heavy doors, small windows set high in thick walls, but its function had been utterly transformed. The cells that had once housed seminarians preparing for ordination now held SOE agents who had parachuted into the Netherlands expecting to fight, and had instead walked directly into the hands of German counterintelligence. By the late summer of 1943, several dozen of them occupied the facility, most in a state of resigned compliance. The Germans had made promises. Cooperate, and you will be kept alive. Do not attempt to escape, and you will be treated as prisoners of war. The promises were delivered with a veneer of professional courtesy that many of the prisoners, exhausted and demoralized, found easier to accept than to challenge. Most had stopped thinking about escape. The seminary was well guarded, the surrounding countryside was occupied territory, and even if a man made it past the walls and the wire, the nearest neutral border was hundreds of miles away, through some of the most densely surveilled land in Western Europe. Two men refused to accept this calculus. Peter Doorlijn was 24 years old, a former policeman and sailor from the Netherlands who had killed a Dutch Nazi collaborator in 1941 and fled to England by stealing a lifeboat. His SOE trainers had described him as quiet and reasonable in normal circumstances, but capable of a fierce, uncontrollable anger when provoked. His codename was Sprout. He had been dropped near Ermelo in Gelderland province in February 1943 and arrested within moments of touching the ground, greeted by a German reception committee that offered him English cigarettes and a nip of whiskey before the handcuffs came out. In the cell next to his was Johan Ubink, 21, a former Dutch naval officer who had reached England by a circuitous route through Sweden, Russia, Iran, and India before being recruited by SOE and dropped into Holland at the end of November 1942. His codename was Chive. Ubink had been captured by the same method: a friendly greeting from men he believed to be resistance fighters, a request to hand over his pistol, and then a sudden seizure from behind. The two men could not see each other, but they found ways to communicate. They tapped Morse code on the radiator pipes that ran between their cells. They dug a small hole in the shared wall, painstaking work done in silence with whatever implements they could fashion, and whispered through it in the dark. Doorlijn did not believe the German promises. He had seen enough of the occupation to understand that promises from captors were currencies of convenience, honored only as long as they served a purpose. When the agents ceased to be useful, when the England spiel ended, as it inevitably would, the promises would end too. Escape was not a romantic impulse. It was a survival calculation. Through the hole in the wall, the two men began to plan. Above each cell door was a small barred window designed to allow guards to observe the occupants. Doorlijn remembered a detail from the escape briefings SOE agents had received before deployment, often delivered by veterans of prisoner-of-war camps from the First World War. That prison bars were frequently spaced far enough apart for a determined man to squeeze through. Using a length of thread, he measured the gaps between the bars above his door. It would be tight, but it was possible. He and Ubink spent days preparing. They cut their bed sheets into strips and knotted them into ropes. Both men were sailors, and their knots would hold. They selected their moment with care. A moonless Sunday night at the end of August 1943, when the guard rotation was thinnest and the darkness would be complete. That evening the dinner trolley made its rounds. One of Doorlijn's cellmates, aware of the plan, begged him to abandon it. The risk was suicidal, the man argued. The Germans would shoot them. Dauerlin said nothing. He waited until the trolley turned the corner at the end of the corridor and knocked on the wall, the prearranged signal. Then he opened the barred window above his door and pushed his head through the gap. From the adjacent cell, Ubbink did the same. For the first time, the two men looked at each other. The corridor was empty. They squeezed their bodies through the bars, a contortion that left bruises and scrapes on their ribs and hips, and dropped silently to the corridor floor. Moving quickly but carefully, they followed the path the dinner trolley had taken, staying behind it as it completed its circuit, using its noise and presence to mask their movement. They reached a bathroom used by the guards and slipped inside, locking themselves in a stall. For 6 hours they sat in near total silence, listening to the sounds of the facility settling into its nighttime routine. Footsteps passing, doors closing, the occasional murmur of conversation from a guard post. Outside, a thunderstorm had rolled in, and rain hammered the building's windows. It was perfect weather for what came next. As midnight approached, they opened the bathroom window. A searchlight beam swept methodically along the exterior walls, illuminating each window in sequence. They timed its rhythm, waited for it to pass, and looped their knotted sheet ropes around a bar on the window frame. They squeezed through, lowered themselves to the ground, and released the ropes. They were outside the building, but the compound was surrounded by barbed wire fencing. On their stomachs, they crawled through the wet grass toward it, pressing themselves flat as a patrolling guard passed within yards of them without looking down. Ubbink reached the fence first and climbed, hauling himself over the top. Dauerlin followed, pulling his sleeves over his hands to protect against the barbs. He snagged, his clothing caught on the wire, and for a terrible, suspended moment, he hung there, exposed. Then he tore free and dropped to the ground on the other side. They ran. Behind them, the seminary sat dark and quiet, the absence of 2 prisoners not yet discovered. Ahead lay the occupied Netherlands, then Belgium, then France, then the Swiss border. Weeks of movement through hostile territory, sheltered by a Catholic priest they found in a nearby town, passed between sympathizers in a chain of safe houses, traveling by night, hiding by day. In late November 1943, they crossed into neutral Switzerland and reported immediately to the British military attaché. The entire Dutch SOE network, they said, was compromised. Every agent had been captured. The Germans controlled every radio channel. But Giskes had anticipated this moment. Before the two men could reach London, a message arrived through one of the compromised Dutch channels, ostensibly from another SOE agent, warning that Dauerlin and Ubbink had been turned by the Gestapo and were now working for the Germans. When the 2 escapees finally reached England, they were not welcomed as the bearers of critical intelligence. They were arrested, placed under guard in a British facility, and held there through the winter, through the spring, and through the Normandy invasion in June 1944. The system that had failed to listen to its own codes now refused to listen to the men who had risked everything to deliver the truth in person. The April Fool's message. By the early months of 1944, the architecture of denial that had sustained the England spiel for nearly 2 years was collapsing under the accumulated weight of evidence that could no longer be explained away. MI6, which had maintained its own intelligence networks in the Netherlands separate from SOE's compromised channels, had suspected problems for months. It had been slow to share its concerns. The rivalry between the 2 organizations ensured that warnings were delayed, filtered through layers of institutional mistrust, and delivered in forms calculated to protect MI6's own reputation rather than to save lives. But the warnings eventually reached Baker Street. Georgius Dessing, the one SOE agent who had managed to avoid capture in the field, had finally returned to London after escaping through Switzerland and confirmed what Marx had argued, what Lauders's missing security checks had signaled, and what Dauerlin and Ubbink had risked their lives to report. The Dutch operation was not merely compromised. It had been entirely controlled by German counterintelligence from the moment Lauders was arrested in March 1942. Every agent sent after that date had been delivered directly to the enemy. Every message received had been drafted by the Abwehr. Every guilder, every weapon, every name had gone straight into German hands. In January 1944, the truth reached the highest levels of British command. General Hastings Ismay, Churchill's chief military assistant, informed the Prime Minister that his secret army in Holland, the resistance infrastructure SOE had been building for over 2 years, had been penetrated for many months. The word was diplomatic. The reality was total. There was no secret army. There never had been. The resistance networks that appeared in SOE's files, the sabotage operations reported as successes, the trained operatives supposedly coordinating with local fighters. All of it was fiction, authored by Hermann Giskes and transmitted by captured radio operators whose warnings had been systematically ignored. Giskes himself had sensed the shift. Since December 1943, the messages coming from London had grown more cautious, more guarded. Requests that would once have been fulfilled without hesitation were now being questioned or delayed. The flow of agents had stopped entirely after the RAF suspended its flights to Holland in May 1943, and no effort had been made to resume them. The England game was winding down, and Giskes knew it. He chose to end it on his own terms. On April 1, 1944, April Fool's Day, he transmitted an unencrypted message directly to SOE headquarters in London. The message dispensed with all pretense of coded communication. It was written in plain English, and its tone was one of mock professional courtesy. Giskes addressed it to the heads of SOE's Dutch section and expressed his regret that London had recently been attempting to conduct business in the Netherlands without his assistance. He noted the long and mutually satisfactory cooperation between his organization and theirs, during which he had served as their sole representative in the country. He assured them that any future visitors to the continent would be received with the same care and attention as all those who had been sent before. The message was a taunt. It was also a formal declaration that the game was over, delivered with the precise cruelty of a man who understood exactly what he had accomplished and wanted his opponents to understand it too. The human cost of the England spiel defied easy accounting, though the numbers themselves were stark. Between November 1941 and May 1943, SOE had sent 54 agents into the Netherlands. 50 were captured by the Germans. Of those 50, only 4 survived the war. The rest, 47 men and women who had volunteered for the most dangerous work their country could ask of them, were killed. Most met their end at Mauthausen concentration camp. In September 1944, as Allied forces advanced into the Netherlands and the German position in Western Europe deteriorated, the captured agents were transported from Haren to Mauthausen in Austria. They had been promised that cooperation would keep them alive. The promise, as Dauerlein had suspected from his cell, was worthless. At Mauthausen on September 6 and 7, 1944, the agents were executed. They had been held for months or years, interrogated, used, and finally discarded when their continued existence became an inconvenience. The manner of their deaths, recorded in the sparse administrative language of the camp's records, was unremarkable by the standards of Mauthausen, a facility whose primary function was the systematic destruction of human life. But each of those deaths represented a specific failure, a security check ignored, a warning suppressed, an institutional incentive to believe what was convenient rather than what was true. The material losses compounded the human ones. The 355,500 guilders SOE had sent to Holland were spent by the Abwehr. The weapons, hundreds of tons of arms and explosives, intended to equip a Dutch resistance that was being dismantled even as London believed it was being built, were seized and catalogued. The communications equipment was studied by German technicians, and the names of Dutch civilians that SOE had transmitted as potential resistance contacts became arrest lists. The damage extended beyond the war's immediate timeline. When Allied forces launched Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the ambitious and ultimately disastrous attempt to secure a series of bridges in the Netherlands and drive into the German heartland, The British 1st Airborne Division, dropped at Arnhem, was ordered not to cooperate with the Dutch resistance. The trust had been poisoned by the England spiel. The resistance, which had survived in fragmented form despite everything the Germans had done to destroy it, possessed local knowledge, communication networks, and a willingness to fight that could have materially aided the beleaguered paratroopers. But the British command, still reeling from the scale of SOE's failure, would not risk relying on Dutch networks that might be compromised. The division fought alone and was largely destroyed. After the war, Hermann Giskes was arrested by British forces. He was not tried for war crimes. He was subsequently employed by the United States during the occupation of Germany. His expertise in counterintelligence considered too valuable to waste on accountability. In the Netherlands, the England spiel cast a long and bitter shadow. Conspiracy theories proliferated for decades, fueled by the destruction of many SOE records in a fire in London shortly after the war's end. Many Dutch citizens could not accept that the catastrophe had been the product of incompetence alone. The failure was too complete, too systematic, too perfectly ruinous. There had to have been a traitor. There had to have been a deliberate sacrifice. But the files released from British archives beginning in 1998 told a story that was both simpler and more disturbing than any conspiracy. The England spiel was the product of sound German police work on one side and profound Anglo-Dutch institutional failure on the other. Wishful thinking, bureaucratic self-preservation, interdepartmental rivalry, and a fundamental unwillingness to confront evidence that contradicted preferred narratives. These were the forces that fed agent after agent into the machinery of the England game. Leo Marx never forgot. He carried his anger for the rest of his life, channeling it into a post-war career as a playwright and screenwriter. His memoir, published decades later, burned with a fury that time had not diminished. The codes had warned London. The flawless transmissions had warned London. The missing security checks, flagged and filed and ignored, had warned London. A young man in a cell in The Hague had spelled the word cat across message after message, letter by letter, and no one had read it. The spy carried nothing but paper into occupied Holland, cipher keys and frequencies and names written in invisible ink on silk. That paper was supposed to be his lifeline. It was supposed to keep him connected to the people who had sent him and who bore responsibility for his life. Instead, the institution behind him failed at every level where it mattered, and the paper became the instrument of his destruction. The weapon was never the paper itself. The weapon was the refusal to read what it said.